more than hundreds of thousands probably of phrases can work out to 666. For example, one such claim made almost right away after Christ's time was that the Emperor Nero represented the 666. Now, I agree that Nero was probably the most evil of all the Roman emperors. He ordered his first wife killed. He ordered his mother killed. His second wife, he's rumored to have killed her by kicking her in the stomach. So when she was pregnant, by the way. So he was pretty vile. He hated the Christians. But you try to get Nero to equal 666, and you're not even going to come close. You're going to come to 336. So what people do is, because people fall in love with numbers and they want them to equal what they want them to equal. So they'll start turning it into a phrase. So what about the word Satan? Does Satan equal 666? Definitely not. So what they would do is they would add additional words and they would make it a satanic mark. And then it works out to 666. And they think, oh, that's got special relevance then. Or Satan's with a comma S, Satan's possessive seal, or image of Satan. They all work out to 666 then. All we really know is that 666 is symbolic of the name of the second beast who gets his power from Satan. That's all we know. Hence, when my youngest daughter, Shelley, says, whoa, that's not a good number. So that's where she's getting that from. But there appears to be some numbers in the Bible that are actually quite good. For example, Jacob had how many sons? 12, right. And there were 12 tribes of Israel. And there were 12 spies sent out to scout the new promised land. There were 12 disciples. There were 12 baskets that remained full after feeding 5,000 people, one of which could not have been my son-in-law. That wouldn't have happened. There were 12 minor prophets. It seems like a good number. Nothing concrete in the Bible to make it exceptional. Nothing concrete, but there's a lot of things we see it popping up. Another number that you're going to be quite familiar is 7. 7 appears to be quite good, right? God made 7 days in a week. And then he made the 7th one special. And then he made 7 annual holy days. You got the first day of unleavened bread, the last day. You got Pentecost or Feast of Weeks, trumpets, atonement, the first day of tabernacles, and the 8th day. An animal, think of this, an animal had to be left with its mother for 7 full days before it could be sacrificed. Leprous Naaman was to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times. 7 times. Then we have the command for Joshua to march around Jericho 7 days. And on the 7th day, he had to march around 7 times. And there had to be 7 priests with 7 trumpets blowing, right? So 7 seems to signify completion of some kind, a divine mandate being fulfilled, or so it would seem. It seems pretty obvious to me, but we can't nail it right down. But you know what? I'm not the only one, because back then, the Jews really thought there was something to this number 7. There were 7 pairs of every clean animal on the ark. The Lord, and if you look in Proverbs 6, verse 16, it says, the Lord hates 7 things. 7 stems were on the tabernacle's lampstand. 7 parables are talked about by Christ in Matthew 13 and 7 woes in Matthew 23. So it became quite significant amongst the Jews. And Peter asked if he had to forgive someone 7 times, right? And Christ replied, he used the same number, right? 70 times 7. So it's a lot of 7s. And I haven't even gone into Revelations because I think there's 50 plus more references to 7 in just in Revelation. 7 churches, 7 spirits, 7 bowls, all that stuff. Now, I don't know why, but I'm assuming most of you are very familiar, aware of the significance of completion attached to the number 7, especially during that time. But there's another number that I find very intriguing, and that's the number 3, the darn old number 3. And I'll tell you why. It has to do with Paul. Paul had that thorn in the flesh that he had to put up with. So we're going to turn over to 2 Corinthians 12. 2 Corinthians 12, and I'll start off way down in verse 6. And Paul says, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 6, if I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it, because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or here in my message. That was an excellent sermon given by Bronson James. I don't know if any of you remember that. Your life should be the best sermon anyone ever hears, watching you, just watching your life. Verse 7, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, if we're all really, really honest, very few of us do exactly what Paul just said right there. It's very hard to do. How many people do you know that take pleasure in their weaknesses? It's pretty hard to say that, any of us. How many love a real good insult? I only know of one person. What's it called? The roast. Remember Dean Martin's roast on TV? They have a roast. They still have a roast on TV, but now it's just crude. It's not even funny. As soon as I see it on there, I turn it off. But back in Dean Martin's day, one guy loved a good insult. Who can name him? Don Rickles. He waited for one person to give him an insult, and then he just let loose. But most people aren't like that. And I can point out a perfect example at the Oscars would be Will Smith, right? And look at got him into big trouble. And then when you go on and read about hardships and persecutions and troubles, I can safely assume that most of us are out. There's no pleasure in that. That's when we become more like David, and we like to end up praying for the destruction of our enemies. And not just once, we do it over and over. So why did Paul only beseech the Lord 3 times? First off, let's see if we're reading that wrong. So if we go to Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16, we're going to look at what appears to be a contradiction in the Bible. It's not a contradiction. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16 says, 3 times, here's that number again, 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose. And then it goes on to name those 3 times, right? But when we read that, we naturally assume 3 times must mean 3 seasons. But let's go on reading. In the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. So the command seems pretty specific, right? Because it's naming 3 specific holy days. Except we know the commanded festivals number 7. We know that for sure, which is pretty obvious if you turn to Leviticus 23, which we've all done many times. Consequently, the church interprets 3 times meaning to mean 3 seasons, those 3 seasons. And look at just the word Passover. Passover, we relate it to the Lord's Supper. We relate it to the killing of the lamb. Plus, we relate it to the whole unleavened bread season. They're all called the Passover in the New Testament. Pardon me. So, consequently, our interpretation of 3 times seems to mean 3 seasons. Seems pretty obvious. If we read the same verse in the New Living Translation, you can see the bias. Wait, did I jump ahead there? No. We can see the bias much clearer in the New Living Translations, but we know you still need to mesh this commandment with what you read in Leviticus 26. So Deuteronomy 6, verse 16, every year every man in Israel must celebrate these 3 festivals, obviously is talking about times. So the 3, because if we turn to Leviticus 23, in verse 23, you see they're talking about trumpets, right? And it says the exact same thing as we just read in Deuteronomy 16. The Lord said to Moses, give the following instruction to the people of Israel. On the first day of the appointed month in early autumn, you are to observe a day of complete rest. It will be an official day for holy assembly, a day commemorated with loud blasts of a trumpet. You must do no ordinary work on that day. Instead, you are to present special gifts to the Lord, just like the description we read in Deuteronomy 16, except it's another day. It's the fourth day. Day of Atonement, verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, be careful to celebrate the Day of Atonement. Same thing, present gifts. Go down to verse 33, the Feast of Booths. Gives the same instruction. For 7 days you must present special gifts. This is verse 36. To the Lord. The 8th day is another holy day in which you present your special gifts to the Lord. So getting back to Paul, did he literally beseech the Lord with his thorn in the flesh 3 times? Or did he do it over 3 seasons of prayer and fasting when he poured his heart out over and over? I'm pretty suspicious that the problem comes from a parable that Jesus gave about a widow and a judge. So let's look at that parable. But it's in Luke 18. It's in Luke 18, and it is literally labeled the parable of the persistent widow. Now, we know those words, that label is not in the original documents, right? That's just added for our benefit in the Bible now. We can pick it out real quick. This is a good example of checking your translations, I'll tell you right now, because I greatly like to read from the New Living Translations, but the King James is way better right now. So I'll explain it why as we read through. Luke 18 and verse 1. And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man, and there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, she'd gotten to him, right? That word troubles is very accurately translated, troubleth. I will avenge her, lest by her continually coming she weary me. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith, and shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith on the earth? So the initial phrase in verse 1, which is not to faint, that's the original phrase. In your King James Version, or in the New Living, it says never give up, gives us a common understanding of this parable, and it implies ongoing prayers to infinity about any topic, right? It gives us a common understanding. However, the Greek word used here is ekakeo, which really means exactly what the King James Version says, not to faint. And if you look up the synonyms for that, is to be weak or weary. I'm pretty sure Jesus is not suggesting prayer to infinity on any issue like Paul's, but rather that we should pray boldly, not faintly, boldly. We should come before God's throne like this woman did, boldly, pleading her case, point by point, being explicit in her reasons why, and going through it issue by issue. I have a very good friend who's the president of our association back where I worked in Guelph. And he uses this widow's example as a model of how to bargain. And this guy is, I'm telling you, he's one of the best bargainers in Ontario. Other cities hire him to plead their case before an arbitrator. But anyways, he will go on and on discussing every point minutely for as long as it takes for you to understand my position. That's exactly how he does it. And he literally wears them down. That is how I picture this widow. She's insistent. She's expressive. She is boldly looking for a fair response. Don't forget, God is not the unjust judge. He doesn't answer prayer because we have wearied him or to merely get rid of us. The parable is saying this: if this is what an unjust judge would do, shouldn't you expect even better treatment from God? That's what it's talking about. That's the bottom line. And if you read verse 5 again, she hasn't continually come back, has she? It doesn't say she's continually come back. He's scared she will continually come back. There is another parable that is also cited as an example of persistent prayer, and that's in Luke 11. This is a parable about a man that comes to his friend. His friend. That's key to understanding this. His friend in the middle of the night to borrow bread. And people get the idea that he's going to keep banging on the door. He's going to be persistent, right? He's going to keep knocking on the door until his friend gets up and helps him out. Jesus said, verse 8, Luke 11 and verse 8, I say unto you, though he will not rise and give him because he is his friend, yet because of his importunity, that's the key word, he will rise and give him as many as he needs. And I say unto you, ask and it shall be given you, seek you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. Interesting, this word importunity can be equally translated impudence. Let me give you some synonyms for impudence straight from the dictionary. Cheeky. I remember I started at a job when I was a young man, and one of my bosses kept coming over. And back then you could smoke in the office, right? Everyone can remember that. And he'd be leaning over my desk smoking, and I'd say, please, Gord, can you leave the smokes in your office when you're coming to talk? Because it really bothers me. And he goes, aren't you an impudent young man? So I thought, impudent? And I had to go look it up real fast. Means insolent, brazen, or shameless. And it goes on and on. Of course, now he would be impudent if he did it this day and age, wouldn't he? Because it's just no longer accepted. He knew his cheeky little friend was going to be, well, he was surprised that his cheeky friend was so bold as to knock in the middle of the night. Although, again, many translations like to point out that it's his persistence that is important. It's not. Verse 8 says it quite accurately, because of his importunity, which can mean persistence, but it more directly translates as impudence or boldness. His boldness to come in the middle of the night to ask for a favor. Just another example of how bias comes into play when we read different translations. Verse 9 is basically saying, ask, seek, and knock. Get on your knees boldly before God and plead your case. He is looking for sincere, heartfelt, deep conversations, one given with faith, one given with humility and trust. If you want a good example, a really good example, we'll turn to Matthew 26. Matthew 26, here Christ went away from the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed not once, not twice, but 3 times. So we got that number again. Matthew sets the scene for us. The disciples and Jesus cross the Kidron Valley to Gethsemane. Jesus stops and he leaves most of the men behind, but he brings 3 guys, Peter, James, and John. Remember those 3 names. Stick them in the back of your head. Peter, James, and John. Okay? Then with Christ, 4 of them go further into the garden, and he posts those 3 men to keep watch, and Christ goes even further in the garden to pray alone. Now, let me ask you something. If he was alone, how do we know what he said in prayer? How do we know? It's obvious how we know, right? Because he must have told the disciples later, else how would anyone know? Here's all we know of this prayer. So now I'm going to be reading from the NLT. Verse 39, Matthew 26, verse 39. He went on a little farther and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Then Matthew tells us he came back to his 3 watchmen and found them asleep. This is how we know that their actual wage-earning jobs that they left to become disciples wasn't really fishermen, they were firefighters. It's a joke. I used to be a firefighter. Just insulted myself, so I don't like it. We'll move on. So Christ wakes them up and he goes to pray again. And this is what we know of that prayer. Matthew 26, verse 42. He went away the second time now and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, your will be done. And he came and he found them asleep again, for their eyes were weary and heavy. And he left them and went away again and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same words. Now, won't you agree with me? Those 3 prayers were very short, quite close together. I know some of you are saying, if you look up, there's 3 books that's in. Well, he said, could you not watch with me 1 hour? And I know some of you would assume that he prayed for approximately an hour. Personally, I think it's unlikely we have to take that assumption. You can make that assumption. We can't prove it one way or another. or that Jesus said or didn't say anything else in his prayer. If we're honest with ourselves, we just don't know, right? We only know what we can read. That's all that's there. Consequently, it's just as likely that Jesus was lost, this is what I think, deep in thought, meditating for at least a good portion of that hour or some of that time. And maybe, we don't know, the recorded words are the entire prayer. Mark, if we turn over to Mark, Mark's gospel sets the scene, but the same scene, but uses slightly different words for the prayer. Luke, let's forget about that. But Luke, if we had only Luke's account, we would assume that Jesus had only prayed twice. Let's turn to Luke instead, Luke 22, because Luke adds something else that will help us with what we were just pondering. Luke 22, verse 41, that's way down. Luke 22, verse 41. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. So we know that the hour Jesus spoke of was occupied with both prayer and a conversation with a being that I personally assume, and I'm very confident in my own assumption, but you don't have to be, that this angel was a very good friend of his. I'm assuming that, because why would God send one that wasn't, right? John's gospel doesn't even include the prayers, but just sets the scene. So it's interesting to me that Jesus took Peter, James, and John, those three people in the back of your head, and wrote about it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Isn't that weird, eh? Obviously, the whole scene here became quite the hot topic of conversation amongst the disciples. The bottom line is, Jesus prayed 3 times about the same thing. The prayers were relatively short. They were very intense, pointedly said the same thing. You can see how he ramped up his prayers, asking for what was coming to go away, just like you and I would do if we were facing the same situation, which really shows, think about it, Jesus' humanity. And then in the process of these prayers, works his way through them and realizes what he has to do. There's no getting out of it. He has to do it, right? That's what Christ had to do. Now take this event and put it beside what happened to Paul, and I think we can assume Paul specifically asked God for relief from his thorn on 3 occasions, and then either came to the realization on his own or from the Lord literally speaking to him that the thorn was for the purpose that God described. So can we say this is a hard and fast rule? No, you can't. You can only meditate on these things. You can only put them through your mind and think about it. But there might be a principle lurking in the background. I think there's another relevant story in the book of Acts. So we're going to turn to the 10th chapter of Acts. And here I'm going to read from the International Standard Version. The 10th chapter of Acts is a really good story. Acts 10, verse 1. Now in Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius. I had a really good friend. His brother was Cornelius. We called him Corky. So every time I see this, I always think Corky in my head. I convert it instantly. A centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He was a devout man who feared God. Anyone want to give me a synonym for devout? Anyone? Devout. Usually the first word that comes to most people's minds, tell me if this is true, is godly. You're a devout person. That's, if you look it up, synonyms, it would be godly, who feared God, as did everyone in his home. He obviously was a good influence, right? He gave many gifts to the poor among the people and always prayed to God. One day, around 3 p.m, he had a vision and clearly saw that 3 doesn't count, okay, because that's not what we would call that. Back then, they wouldn't have said 3 p.m, would they? They would have said the 9th hour. Because they go, yeah. And clearly saw an angel of God coming to him and saying to him, Cornelius. He stared at the angel in terror and asked, what is it, Lord? And the angel answered him, your prayers and your gifts to the poor have arisen as a reminder to God. Send men now to Joppa and summon Simon, who is called Peter. He is a guest of another Peter, Simon, a leather worker, whose house is by the sea. Now, I'm sure Cornelius had no idea what was going on, but being an officer, he would have been very good at taking and giving orders. And sure enough, verse 7, when the angel who had spoken to him had gone, Cornelius summoned two of his household servants and a devout soldier, one of those who served him regularly. He explained everything to them and sent them to Joppa. So there's 3 men going to Joppa right now. Now the whole story focuses on Peter. It switches over instantly. At his own hour of prayer, he's gone up on the roof for a little privacy, and it's dinner time. So the smells from dinner are drifting up, perking up his appetite. He falls into a trance. What do you think he dreams about? Food, of course, because he smells it. So let's slip down to verse 11. And Peter saw heaven open and something like a large linen sheet coming down, being lowered by its 4 corners to the ground. In it were all kinds of 4-footed animals, reptiles, and birds of the air. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill something and eat it." But Peter said, "Absolutely not, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Again, the voice came to him a second time, "You must stop calling unclean what God has made clean." This happened 3 times. Then the sheet was quickly taken back into heaven. Now, Peter did not take this to mean, because I read a version, I can't remember which version it was. Right after that, it says, this is where God made all animals clean. Has anyone seen that translation? I read that once and I thought, wow, where does that come from? So they just slipped them in, right? But Peter did not take this to mean that part of the law had been abolished. I'll tell you that right now. Instead, the biblical commentator, Albert Barnes, says, this was done thrice, 3 times, doubtless to impress the mind of Peter with the certainty and importance of the vision. While Peter was pondering what these visions meant, the 3 men from Cornelius arrived at the house. Okay. So let's jump down to verse 19. Peter was still thinking about the vision when the Spirit told him, "Look, 3 men are looking for you. Get up, go downstairs, and don't hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." This is how we have a little bit different understanding of what words mean in our minds. Because when I read that, "don't hesitate to go with them," I would have met them downstairs, put them in the car, and away we were gone, right? But if we read on, so Peter went to the men and said, "I'm the man you're looking for. Why are you here?" And the men replied, "Cornelius, a centurion and an upright and God-fearing man." Again, we read that about Cornelius, right? An upright and God-fearing man who was respected by the whole Jewish nation, was instructed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his home and hear what you have to say. So Peter welcomed them in as his guest. The next day, he got up and went with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa went along with them. So there was the 3 men, Peter, and some more men. So we know at least 2 more. That's up to 6 now, right? The day after that again, they arrived in Caesarea, verse 24. Cornelius was expecting them and had called his relatives and close friends together. So we got Cornelius's family, his relatives, and his close friends. We got quite a group now. This is turned to be like a church outing. Then when Peter was about to enter, Cornelius met him, bowed down, verse 25, bowed down at his feet and began to worship him. So that all of you should be taking a full pause right there and stopping, because now we've called Cornelius a devout man, a godly man, a God-fearing man. God actually sent an angel to talk to him directly, and yet Cornelius is worshiping a man. So that's odd, right? Peter, something we all know, that for him to bow down to worship Peter is a major faux pas. Interestingly, this is just a little side I want to show you. That points out rather explicitly that we're all on a journey. Every one of us, we're learning and growing. God obviously wanted Cornelius to keep growing because he sent Peter to him specifically for that. Because God liked this man, right? He didn't give up on him. He didn't turn his back on him or call him a pagan because he didn't understand a rather important concept. He didn't understand one of the first 3 most important of the commandments, and neither should we. Let's read on. Verse 26. But Peter made him get up, saying, stand up. I too am only a man. As Peter talked to him, he went in and found that many people had gathered. He told them, you understand how wrong it is for a Jew to associate or visit with a Gentile? But God has shown me that I should stop calling anyone common or unclean. And that is why I didn't hesitate when I was sent for. The vision was given 3 times. 3 men were waiting for him. Even if the number 3 meant nothing, it at least served to minimize any thoughts of coincidence. So let's jump down to verse 34 and see the conclusion of this part of the story. Then Peter began to speak. Now I understand that God shows no partiality. Indeed, whoever fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him in any nation. But the story doesn't really end there. Because when Peter had to explain what he had done to the Jews, this story presented a new hard fact for them. The Jews, their own rules about not eating with Gentiles was pointless. It was pointless because God was sending the gospel to everyone. Still, it seems the idea of 3 times repetition of the vision when he told the story to the Jews carried some level of significance with them. It carried some level of certainty or of importance. The number 3 pops up again and again. In scripture, it's all over the place. So there seems to be a strong indication that we should pay some kind of special attention to it. 3 times or 3 seasons in the year, you're supposed to go to observe the holy days. Kind of an important thing. There's some importance put to it. 3 times, Balaam's donkey saved him from that angel who was going to cut his head off. 3 times the poor beast was beaten before actually speaking up. When Balaam got to where he was going, he couldn't curse Israel as requested. He ended up blessing them 3 times. David bowed down to Jonathan 3 times before they parted. When Elijah laid on that dead child, he laid on him 3 times before he revived him. Daniel prayed 3 times in the face of death. Jesus was in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah was in the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Lazarus was dead 3 days before we were resurrected. And there's lots of commentary on that because 3 signified some level of certainty. So they knew for sure Lazarus was dead. He'd been dead for 3 days, and then he was resurrected. Peter denied Christ 3 times. And Jesus demanded Peter's love 3 times. I can honestly say, I don't know. I don't understand the whole topic because there's lots of things we don't understand in the Bible. But there's lots of things I think have been put in the Bible to make us think, to make us ponder, to make us look deeper. Because there's some certainty to some of these things, and it still intrigues me. However, I do see this. From doing just this quick little topic right here, I can see that there has to be an end. There has to be some kind of closure to ongoing petitions to God. We pray to God looking for an answer, and then it seems like we don't want the answer. I don't want the answer. I'm going to keep praying because that's not the answer I want. But that's not it. There's the example of the unjust judge, which I hopefully showed that doesn't mean unending petitions on any given request, but rather sincerity and boldness. There comes a time when we, like Paul, need to accept God's answer and move on down the road. I'm not sure God is pleased with whining and nagging. Remember what Solomon said, because Solomon kind of touched on this topic. In Ecclesiastes 5, I'm just going to read, you don't have to turn there. He says, watch your step whenever you visit God's throne. So obviously it's talking about prayer, right? Watch your step whenever you visit God's throne and come more ready to listen than to offer a full sacrifice, since fools never think they're doing evil. Verse 2, don't be impulsive with your mouth or be in a hurry to talk in God's presence. Since God is in heaven and you're on earth, keep your speech short. Too many worries lead to nightmares, and a fool is known from talking too much. It's funny how people like to pray on and on and on and on, where God just wants you to pray sincerely, deeply about whatever it is. Spending a long time in prayer doesn't necessarily mean rambling on the whole time. Too many words is the habit of fools. That's what it says. Rather, spend your time working your way through the issues and clarifying your requests. The end of my sermon today is this. Both Paul and Jesus felt they had their answer after the third request. I'm not sure it's God's will that we go on in a continual state of frustration. There comes a time when we have to accept that's his answer. And while it might certainly not be what we had hoped for, it's what's best for us. After all, it seems when you're weak, that's when you can do great things.